Welcome, everyone, to the onpoli podcast. I'm Steve Paikin.
And I'm John Michael McGrath.
Today on the pod, the Trump tariffs may be on pause, but they've taken over the narrative of this Ontario election campaign.
The Liberals are determined to keep the focus on Doug Ford's healthcare record.
Meantime, the election isn't even a week old yet, and the Conservatives already have endorsements from 4 labor unions.
And our quote of note this week focuses on, what else? Trump and tariffs.
It's Tuesday, February 4th, 2025, so let's get to it. JMM?
Hello, sir.
Here we are, our first Tuesday, right?
Yes, first Tuesday.
We have to remind people, in case they haven't heard, that during this 44th general election campaign, JMM and I are not only doing the thing Friday night, as we always did, but we are adding a second podcast to the onpoli schedule. So every Tuesday, right up until February 27th, Election Day, we're going to be here as well, because you just can't get enough of us, right?
Yeah, so we'll be doing election night, and then I imagine we'll do a Friday podcast thereafter as well.
Right, day after the election.
We're going to be busy.
Absolutely. Now, and this date, incidentally, February 4th, today, is also an interesting anniversary of sorts. It was 15 years ago today that voters in Toronto Centre voted in a by-election to replace Liberal Cabinet Minister George Smitherman, who had left Queen's Park to... Do you remember? I think my T-shirt kind of gives it away.
Yes, I do recall that he ran for mayor of Toronto. I covered that race.
Did indeed. Oh, you covered that race. In which case, the next few questions are going to be fairly simple. But do you remember who he ran against?
I do. He ran against there was Joe Pantalone. There was Rocco Rossi. Oh, and Rob Ford.
Yeah,
yes.
That was the guy I was thinking of. Whose brother is?
The current premier, Doug Ford.
Everything connects.
Yes.
You see that? Back in 2010, Doug Ford's brother Rob won that election with nearly half the votes. And the polls today show that Doug Ford and his PCs are leading the pack with, you guessed it, nearly half the votes. Incidentally, do you remember who won the by-election to replace George Smitherman in Toronto Centre? I can give you a hint if you need one.
I actually don't, because he was kind of a big deal in Kathleen Wynne's cabinet when I went to Queen's Park in 2013. That would be Glenn Murray.
You are correct. He thought about running for the Liberal leadership, but then dropped out, backed her, was the mayor of Winnipeg, ran to be leader of the Greens.
Yes.
Didn't win that one.
Yes.
But he had a good time at Queen's Park. He had a meaningful career at Queen's Park.
Minister of Infrastructure and Minister of Transportation, if I recall correctly, and then became Minister of Environment later on, and stick-handled the early implementation of the cap-and-trade system.
Absolutely right. There we go. So that's the explanation behind the T-shirt for today. I'm going to continue to pull out some of the old T-shirts from back in the day. I think I had one for Jack Layton. This one's for George Smitherman. So next one's going to be for a Tory. You watch.
I have no explicitly political T-shirts that I can think of. No campaign swag that I know of.
That is obvious, given your choice of wardrobe on this podcast.
Yes,
I can tell.
Yes, no, I tend more towards dinosaurs and aliens.
And with I could do a line with that, but I'll hold it. Off to issue 1. Ontario's 44th general election was barely a few days old when Donald Trump and his tariffs moved center stage in the campaign narrative. Suddenly, issues that normally would have taken up a lot of bandwidth in a provincial election campaign, well, they moved to the sidelines. However, yesterday afternoon, the country caught a bit of a break. After a conversation with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Trump agreed to delay the tariffs for 30 days, but this was an angry Doug Ford yesterday morning.
But I'm not going to support someone that is hell-bent on destroying our province, destroying people's families, taking jobs away from them. We're done with that. We never started this fight whatsoever, but we're going to win this fight.
Doug Ford yesterday. JMM, what else can you tell us about how Ontario is reacting to all this?
Well, of course, we have a list of measures that the province was prepared to take that are currently on pause. The LCBO, we already discussed last week, was preparing to take American products off of the shelves as certainly one of the world's largest buyers of alcohol. That could have taken a bite out of U.S. sales. Ford had also announced that the government was going to prohibit American firms from bidding on Ontario government contracts. So that was like procurement and infrastructure contracts. Potentially, the government is talking about spending $200 billion over the next decade on infrastructure. So cutting American firms out of that amount of work would would have been significant. Then he had also announced that the province was going to tear up the $100 million contract with Starlink. This is Elon Musk's satellite-based internet service provider that Ontario has signed a contract with to serve remote and rural communities that are looking for better internet connection. All of those moves are now paused. If tariffs come back again, those moves can also come back again. We are sort of in a weird in-between state right now.
Yeah, Doug Ford, in fact, saying Ontario's not going to do business with people who are hell-bent on destroying our economy, which was, again, ratcheting up the rhetoric a little bit. What's interesting about the Starlink deal is that the Liberal leader, Bonnie Crombie, has been calling for Ford to rip up that deal for about a week now. And initially, Ford said, well, hang on a sec, Elon Musk offered a good service. He offered the best price, so I don't see any reason to cancel the deal here. But clearly, the way things have changed, it just goes to show you, a week is a lifetime in politics, right? And a week later, the Tories pretty clearly changed their minds about this and announced they would end the deal. But that threat is off right now. It's $100 million, but it wasn't set to kick in until June. So no money has been paid yet. And again, we will watch events, dear boy, events unfold to see what will transpire and when.
Yeah, the company that lost the competition to Starlink, I found this interesting yesterday, a Canadian ISP called Explore. On Monday morning, their website featured this big banner that said, built by Canadians for Canadians, which maybe it was a coincidence, but I think it certainly captures the mood that we saw certainly on Monday with a lot of people very angry about the tariff threats. And you know, I'm certainly seeing way more discussion right now of, you know, how does one buy Canadian goods and services, and how does one leave American goods on the shelf. You know, about Starlink, I don't think it is controversial to say that Starlink is the biggest satellite internet service provider, arguably the best. But there are others in the market. Explore being just one example of a firm that is trying to compete in this space. There are more getting into this line of business. So if Ontario has to revisit this decision in a month's time or in 6 months' time, you know, Trump is going to be president for 4 years. There are going to be options to explore. In the meantime, remote and rural communities are still waiting for that improved internet service.
Indeed they are. And with that, we're off to issue 2. Tariffs notwithstanding, the Ontario Liberals are determined to keep Doug Ford's healthcare record in as much of the spotlight as they can. The Liberals have even rented a campaign-style bus with elements of Ford's record on the exterior of that bus. Now, we've actually got some pictures of it here, and for those who are listening on podcast, we'll describe what we're seeing. There's a shot of a red bus, campaign style, but not with Liberal leader Bonnie Crombie's picture on the side, which is normally what you would see during an election campaign. Instead, it says 11,000 people died waiting for surgery last year. This is Doug Ford's Ontario. And then if you go, I don't know if we've got another picture here, but there's, on the other side of the bus, it says 2.5 million people have no family doctor. This is Doug Ford's Ontario. This is unique. I'm not sure I've ever seen this before.
Yeah, I don't know that there is an Ontario precedent. You mentioned it doesn't have Bonnie Crombie's face on it. There is a bit of lettering at the bottom that says, vote Bonnie Crombie to change this, but it doesn't mention the Liberal Party by name as far as I can see. Crombie has really has already done a number of healthcare-focused announcements. The Liberals were attacking the government relentlessly on their healthcare record long before the election was called, so this is not like a surprise. She was in Kitchener-Waterloo this week and announced as part of her idea for a way of tariff-proofing the Ontario economy, that a Liberal government would offer a bonus to Canadian-born nurses, Canadian qualified nurses and doctors who want to return from the U.S. and practice in Ontario. You know, it is interesting, I think, at least as of yesterday, that, you know, with so much focus on tariffs and the threat of tariffs, and obviously, like, the Premier wants to talk about his role as being, you know, the only person who can protect Ontario from the threat of tariffs. The Liberals are not entirely, but pretty consistently sticking to healthcare as a message. They really think that this is a winning message for them.
Well, I think they've pretty clearly come to the conclusion that Doug Ford owns the tariff issues, that if you're going to get into a fight with the Premier on the issue of protecting Ontario, he's got the bigger megaphone for that. So they have determined that they're going to go over something else, and they're moving over to healthcare. Interestingly, the NDP made a different decision. They have focused a lot on tariffs in the first week, saying that they will protect workers to the nth degree, will protect you better than Doug Ford can. I'm not sure how successful they'll be at competing with Ford on that stage. So the Liberals are staying on health care. We'll see what else the NDP's got up its sleeve. Meantime, back to the Liberals. What else they got going?
Well, I do want to stick on this issue of a lack of family doctors. This has been a core part of the Liberal message. They had broken out riding by riding which areas of the province were most in need of family doctors, so that they could attack each individual Conservative candidate and say, in your riding while you were in government, X number of people lacked a family doctor, right? So there's been this consistent thread in their attacks on the government. And just to add on to a bit of what you were saying, I think part of the gamble here, and it is a gamble, is that this is a 4-week campaign, and admittedly, we've spent the first few days talking about tariffs, Trump and tariffs. But are we still going to be talking about that 4 weeks from now? Maybe not. And maybe after, particularly now that the threat seems to have receded until after voting day, maybe some of this stuff will just recede into the background, and it will become a bit more of a conventional election campaign. Ontario election campaigns tend conventionally to be about things like healthcare and education.
Right on.
So this might be a good play for them. I said earlier, I don't know of an Ontario precedent. We couldn't let this segment pass without saying that there is a precedent from another jurisdiction. Some of our viewers and listeners may remember the precedent from not so long ago in the Brexit referendum.
You're talking about the wording on a bus.
Yes.
That precedent.
Yes. So Boris Johnson traveled the UK in a bus campaigning for the Leave side in the Brexit referendum with the message, we send the EU £350 million a week. Let's fund our NHS instead, the NHS being the United Kingdom's National Health Service, their public health provider. This claim, I will say, was hotly contested.
Hotly contested? I think that's a nice way of saying that claim was utter and complete El Toro poo-poo. Yeah.
Yes, hogwash, malarkey,
Yes.
whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And Brexit has not resulted in a windfall for the NHS or anything else. But the Leave campaign did win that referendum, and Boris Johnson would, in fact, become Prime Minister not that long after. So you can't say that the tactic was ineffective.
It was very effective. It just wasn't accurate. Wasn't. What was the thing you said a few weeks ago that I loved so much?
Was that an assertion without evidence or an assertion lacking evidence?
There we go. There we go. Yeah, which is a nice way of saying it was a lie. The Liberal attacks do not end there. They just dropped an ad, I guess it was earlier this week. Premier Ford was caught kind of behind the scenes preparing to do an event with the firefighters, and he was caught on a live microphone saying some things about President Donald Trump. And it didn't take long for the Liberals to take that snippet and turn it into an attack ad. Let's have a little look at a bit of what that ad had to say. Roll it if you would.
Doug Ford just said he was happy Donald Trump won the election.
In the election day, was I happy this guy won? 100% I was.
Happy the guy who campaigned on a trade war with Canada became president?
The tariff will be substantial in some cases.
I am a tariff man standing on a tariff platform.
Was I happy this guy won? 100% I was.
He was happy?
Okay, let's do a little context here, because the ad goes on for another, 35, 40 seconds to basically repeat that same clip. I was 100% happy when Trump won. That will not come as any surprise to anybody who has followed Doug Ford's career. He has said in the past he's been an admirer of Trump's. He has said in the past, I'm a big fan of the Republican Party. He is he came into office in 2018 being a disruptive populist. Yes. So none of that is a surprise. The timing of saying it right now, okay? But what the Liberal ad doesn't do is allow the cameras to continue the rest of what Doug Ford had to say, yes, which was, yeah, I supported him 100%. I was glad that he won. But now that guy has stuck a shiv in us, yes, and I'm not with him anymore. Now I'm off the platform with him right now. So a very clever ad, yeah, well put together, but taken a little out of context.
Yeah, I will say, on the other hand, that it's a fair hit to say that Ford should not have been surprised by what has happened certainly since Trump was elected. I mean, as the ad alludes to, Trump was not mysterious about his intentions yes, to hit every country on earth with tariffs, including Canada. He was saying it for months before the election. So for insofar as there's a fair criticism here, I think it's that the Premier, we can be skeptical of the Premier's buyer's remorse. Let me put it that way.
Yeah, I guess we're entitled to do that. But, these ads are we're going to see a lot of ads before this campaign is over. The Conservatives have got way more money than anybody else. They have been extremely selective in the way that they have tried to frame Bonnie Crombie, the Liberal leader, in the past with those ads, the tagline of which I'm not going to repeat because it just reinforces something that is not true.
Yes.
So this is the nature of the game. You try to frame your opponent before they get a chance to define themselves.
And one other thing I will add, and this is sort of like not even about the content of the ad itself, but this was a pretty quick turnaround for the Liberals, right? The hot mic moment happened yesterday. It started to blow up on social media in the afternoon, and by this, Tuesday morning, the Liberal Party had an attack ad, at least out on social media. I don't imagine they're like buying TV time with it yet, but. One of the things I look for in a campaign is this kind of competence, for lack of a better word, proficiency, right? Can you take a moment that happens live on the campaigning trail, something unexpected, and can you react quickly? And this, not a bad indication of the Liberals being able to react quickly.
Right on. And with that, we're off to issue 3. The last time Ontario had a winter election was 44 years ago. Bill Davis was the premier. He did make a trip to Windsor, but mostly because he sort of had to. But he did not stick around. His plane landed, he got out, did a press conference, then got back in the plane and left. Windsor was just not Tory territory. Fast forward 44 years, and my oh my have things changed. Doug Ford, another PC leader, kicked off his campaign in Windsor on day one because the Tories have former seats they are defending in the Rose City. JMM, what does that say about Ford's relationship with Ontario's mostly private sector unions?
Right. So the PC party is very happy to get the endorsements from Unifor, Leuna, Leuna being a major construction union, the IBEW, and the firefighters.
Firefighters, a public sector union, actually.
Yes, and I'm going to get back to that in 1 second. I mean, one of the big stories in the last election was the amount of labor support that the Progressive Conservatives got and the 8 seats that they took away from the New Democrats. And I mean, seats not just in the Southwest, but in the North, places like Timmins, where they beat Gilles
Bisson.
Bisson, thank you. One of the biggest shifts we've seen in Ontario politics was, the lessened hostility to the labor movement from the Conservative Party. And in response, a lot of labor unions have decided, actually, so long as they're not trying to hurt us, we're willing to throw in with them.
I think at this point we should mention a guy by the name of Monty McNaughton, who is no longer in public life. But he was the guy that Doug Ford gave the job, the mission, in fact, to see what he could do about improving the Progressive Conservative Party's relationship with organized labor, which, of course, has been pretty bad for a very long time. We can remember when Tim Hudak was the leader of the Ontario PC Party, he actually mused, didn't do it, but mused about making Ontario a so-called right-to-work province, where it would be much more difficult to unionize and so on. There was a very nasty relationship between the two. Monty McNaughton was the labor minister who came in and said to Doug Ford, I think I can pry some of these private sector unions away from the Liberals and NDP. Premier Ford said, go ahead, give it a shot. They did very well at it. You pointed out 8 seats going from the NDP to the Conservatives in the last election, which is a bit of an ideological journey. But the Tories had figured out how to make that happen, and now here we are again. There is quite a split in the union movement.
Yes.
The private sector unions really seem to have peeled away a lot of their support from the NDP. Many of them are backing Ford. The public sector unions, with the exception of the firefighters, are still very anti-Ford and still backing, I guess, a mix of the Liberals and NDP. But it is really you really need a score. What do they say? You need a program to know, I'm blowing this line. You need a scorecard to see I forget it. You know the line I'm trying to come up with, but
I'm sorry, it feels too close to a sports metaphor for you.
It is a sports metaphor, which is why I'm embarrassed that I'm blowing it. Bottom line is, you could always guarantee in the past that the Tories would not be getting the backing of any labor unions.
Yeah.
Well, those days are gone.
No, and the firefighters are interesting because, we've talked about this.
Can't tell the players without a program. That's the line I'm thinking of. Can't tell the players without a program. Come on, there we go.
So the firefighters, we mentioned the split between private and public sector unions, but of course the firefighters are a public sector union, but it's worth emphasizing that this is not coming out of the blue, right? The Ford government has made a bunch of changes that firefighters have appreciated, including new money for post-traumatic injury treatment, expanded treatment for cancer acquired while in the line of duty. Probably not a shock to people to say that firefighters they're around fires with lots of burning awful stuff, and they can acquire cancer because of what they just are around all the time. So the Ford government has made these overtures to the movement, and the firefighters are responding in kind. I mean, I certainly was not shocked when we saw that endorsement come forward.
Can we call it a bromance? I think we can. There's definitely a gender split on these things.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I mean, this is one of the criticisms of the Ford government is that, while they have, if we can put it this way, they've made a lot of overtures to more traditionally male-dominated professions in the union space, right? Construction, manufacturing.
Brotherhood of Electrical Workers.
Exactly, right. But when you talk about nurses, PSWs,
early childhood education workers,
right,
daycare
teachers,
workers.
Professions that are more dominated by women, the government has not been as solicitous.
Solicitous is a good word. Okay, up next, our quote of note. Let's return to our top story for our quote of note tonight. Here is Doug Ford, asked by the Globe and Mail's Laura Stone about how he feels about Donald Trump, whom he once quite admired.
Do you still consider yourself a Trump supporter?
Absolutely not.
Can you expand on that?
It's just so disappointing. I'm sure there's millions of Canadians that thought, okay, this might be a good change down in the U.S. It's been a disaster. I'd never support that guy in my entire life. What a, he goes up and just stabs you right in the heart. Forget that.
Okay, and now, as Paul Harvey used to say on the radio, and now you know the rest of the story, right? Like the Liberal ad was from behind the scenes, same event,
Yep.
right? Saying, I was 100% for Trump, loved him, big Republican. That's the rest of the story. Yep. Ford in front of the microphone saying, hell no, he put the shiv in me. I don't want to have anything to do with him anymore.
Yes, definitely no love lost.
Okay, shall we go to the mailbag?
Let's do.
Okay, if you've got a burning question, please send it along to this special email address, onpolitics@tvo.org. JMM, what do we got this week?
Here is a question from Marg Schweitzer from Murillo, Ontario. I don't believe I've ever been to Murillo, but it is just west of Thunder Bay. Marg Schweitzer writes, "Hi, Steve and John Michael. I can't stand politics, but love your show. Go figure. You must be doing something right. You make the most boring stuff come alive, and I've started recording your shows when I'm not around to listen. I don't do podcasts." Fair enough. Anyway, here's my question for you. Were there any Ontario premiers who served in either or both of the 20th century world wars? If so, and I assume they served before becoming premier, did their experience in the war affect how they governed or what they made a priority? Thank you for your answer, Marg.
Marg, I love this question because, of course, it allows us to look back at history, which John Michael and I are both big fans of. The answer is yes, there are certainly 4 premiers I know of that served in the 2 world wars of the 20th century. And yes, of course, it was before they became premier of Ontario. Let's start with the most recent, and we'll go backwards. John Robarts, who was premier from 1961 to 71, he was in the Navy during World War II. You asked whether his wartime service affected his priorities as premier. The answer is, you bet. Here's the story I remember being told. John Robarts was on a ship. He was on a bunk bed. The other guy on the bunk bed was a unilingual Francophone soldier. He was on the bunk bed as a unilingual Anglophone. It's more than just a metaphor, but, we're all in the same bed now, right? We're all in the same ship now. That experience of trying to relate to and communicate with a French-speaking Canadian, I think was part of the mix that allowed John Robarts in 1967, midway through his premiership, to create the Confederation of Tomorrow Conference, which was essentially the first ministers get-together since Charlottetown 100 years earlier. When they created the country, this one was designed to take a look at what was happening in the country in its centennial year, Mr. Robarts was very interested to know why bombs were blowing up in mailboxes in the province of Quebec. And, did his wartime service help contribute to his greater desire to understand Quebec? You bet. I think it sure did. But let's keep going. Leslie Frost, who was premier from 1949 to 61, he was wounded in World War I in 1918. He was a captain. George Drew was premier from 1943 to 48. He also served in World War I, an officer in the Canadian Field Artillery. People, even when he was the federal Tory leader and when he was Premier of Ontario, called him Colonel Drew. He was always known as Colonel Drew. And let's do one more here. Mitch Hepburn was the Premier of Ontario from 1934 to 42. He had already volunteered for World War I before the war began. He eventually served in the Canadian militia. He was transferred to the Royal Air Force. He actually got into a car accident and then got sick, so he was bedridden for much of the war, didn't serve in active duty, but he had volunteered and wanted to be there. So that's the list. Just, some may be wondering, what about Bill Davis? Bill Davis was born in 1929, so when the war began, he was 10 years old, so too young to have participated. So John Robarts was the last premier of Ontario to see action in one of the great wars of the 20th century.
And I have to ask, did you have to look any of that up, or is that just stored away in your mind?
Modesty compels me to say, let me put it this way. I think I knew it, but I fact-checked it anyway, just to make sure it was
best
true.
Practice.
Yeah, best practice.
While we're talking about Northern Ontario, I did get a message from someone who, they asked that I not identify them, and given the context, that's fine. But we were talking about boundary adjustments last week.
Oh, yes. Right.
And how in Northern Ontario, we have not adjusted the seats the way we have in Southern Ontario. The belief from multiple governments now has been that we want to maintain the representation of Northern Ontario. And yet, Northern Ontario's population is smaller than it once was, and it's particularly smaller as a proportion of Ontario's overall population. And this person was happy to provide some numbers. The population of Northern Ontario peaked overall in 1996 at just above 800,000 people. The last census, that was down to 789,000 inhabitants in what we census defined as Northern Ontario. As a percentage of Ontario's population overall, Northern Ontario peaked as the share of 12.8% in the 1941 census.
1941?
Yes, and
Yikes, that's a long time
relative to the rest of Ontario's population, Northern Ontario has been shrinking ever since. A very long decline. It was, as I say, 12.8% in 1941. It is now 5.5% of the Ontario population as of the 2021 census. So, we were talking about how the reason we do reapportionment of seats is because different parts of the province grow at different rates, and this is, I think, one illustration of that. As we preserve the number of seats and, in fact, grow the number of seats in Ontario, in Northern Ontario provincially, the population there is not keeping pace. And I don't think it's the biggest deal in the world. I'm not banging the drum to disenfranchise Northern Ontario, but I think just mathematically, it is the case that there are certainly parts of Northern Ontario that are overrepresented relative to the number of people that are in that part of the province.
I have a couple of follow-up questions.
Okay.
Is the Northern Ontario you are referring to there, does that include Muskoka?
I do not believe it does, no.
Because we talked about this last week,
Yes,
right?
indeed.
Remember the attempts, I think it was Ernie Eves 40 years ago, who tried to, I guess 45 years ago maybe, who tried to, and successfully managed to get Queen's Park to consider Muskoka and Parry Sound part of Northern Ontario in order to be eligible for northern grants and that kind of thing. Okay, so that's not including that. I have to say, and I'll go on record here as saying this, I know there is a principle that every riding in whatever jurisdiction you're talking about should have the same number of people so that everybody's votes count the same.
Yes.
However, there is also a tradition in this province that Northern Ontario, as you've just pointed out, will never have, because of just the vast land spaces and not enough people up there, it will never have the same number of people per riding as the southern ridings south of the French River.
Yes.
And that doesn't trouble me. The services in Northern Ontario are not as good as the services in Southern Ontario. You want to get to a hospital, you want to get to a doctor, You want to get to school, you're going to be going a lot further to do any of those things.
Absolutely.
And if Northern Ontario is disproportionately represented at Queen's Park because it has more seats than its population would justify, I have to say I'm okay with that.
So am I. And, to be blunt about this, the seats in Northern Ontario, even with the current disproportion, if I could put it that way, just mathematically speaking, Northern Ontario is not going to decide this election. It is more competitive than it has been in the past, right? We talked about the Tories winning a seat in Timmins and elsewhere. The Tories are doing well in Northern Ontario. That will be interesting to watch. But it's sort of like, the way PEI has 4 seats. It's okay, great. You've got 4 seats. Toronto has 25, right? This is not where the competition will be won or lost.
And we're more than 6 times bigger than Prince Edward Island. And yet these are some of the things that go along with it. I remember talking to MPPs from up north. If you represent Davenport, as Marit Stiles does,
yes,
you can drive across your riding in 10 minutes.
Yes.
Maybe less. If you're in Northern Ontario, there are some places you cannot drive to. There are some communities you cannot drive to. You've got to fly in to some of the communities that you serve. It's extremely different up there, and so I don't mind the seat count reflecting that.
And we mentioned Gilles Bisson earlier in the podcast, and Gilles Bisson, for his career as an MPP, was always racking up enormous travel expenses, but that was because his riding was so large. He had to fly into some communities, and to save the taxpayers at least some money, he learned how to fly a plane and was literally flying himself around parts of Northern Ontario. So totally different context from what you find in Southern Ontario. Again, if you'd like to ask about any content on the show, you can always email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
And that is the onpoli podcast for this Tuesday, February 4th, 2025.
You can follow our shows on Apple Podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Any feedback you have, we're always happy to hear from you, good, bad, or indifferent. Write us an email. You know the address, onpolitics@tvo.org. Make sure you include your first name, your last name, and where you're coming to us from.
This week's episode was produced by Matthew O'Mara, video and audio editing by Colin Kish.
Production support from Jonathan Hallowell and TVO's Digital Media Services team.
Our managing editor is Katie O'Connor. Lori Few is the executive producer of Digital. John Ferry is vice president, programming and content.
As always, we'd like to thank our studio crew for making the podcast look so good, and we want to remind everybody we're, of course, back Friday night for our regular scheduled podcast, and then we're in here again next Tuesday, twice a week during the writ period. So until Friday, everybody, bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.